I used to try so hard to never be vulnerable. I wouldn't even smile in public. You know how crazy that is? Like not smiling in public. If I made eye contact with another person, I'm immediately scowling. I tell the people in my life that I love them every chance I get. And my goal is to create an environment where people feel comfortable expressing their vulnerability without the fear of judgment. Beautiful people, welcome in to the sixth ever episode of the Homie Love Hour with me, your host, Joe Buck. And I gotta tell you, it feels so good to be here talking to you all about yet another topic that I felt inspired to sit down and do some research on and to come here and share with you all. Now, I had originally planned to do another interview that was going to take place of episode 6, or now I originally had planned to do an interview that was going to be episode 6, but due to weather issues and things like that, I decided, fuck it, we're going to do it live and it'll just be another solo episode. So, in today's episode, I want to talk about something that I feel is very important, especially in this day and age, and that is practicing vulnerability. Now, in this episode, I plan to discuss what vulnerability is, how to practice being vulnerable, and ultimately, I'll do like I always do and throw a couple stories in there. But first, how's your week going? How's it been? Tell me all about it. The good, the bad, the everything in between. I'm here for it. And hopefully, if you don't want to share it with me, you have people in your life that you can share it with. And of course, like always, until I get real sponsors, today's episode is brought to you by High Altitude Comedy and Rite of Passage Overnight Oats. Now, you all have heard the spiel at this point about High Altitude Comedy, but just for those who might be tuning in for the first time, High Altitude Comedy is a stand-up comedy group consisting of Nick Halverson, Timmy Motree, and of course myself. We go all around the Rocky Mountains of Colorado doing shows to perform for literally anyone who will listen to us. We are currently taking the next 2 weeks off while we take care of personal things in our lives, but we just did Leadville. And if you live in Leadville or you were at that show, oh my God, thank you so much. Leadville consistently has been our favorite town to perform in. Like the Leadville crowd always shows up, doesn't matter if it's a packed house or there's just a handful of people. The energy that the crowd puts off gives us so much to feed off of, and everyone, even the comics from Denver, had such a blast. And literally, we can't do it without having people in the crowd to perform to. So, to all of Leadville, everyone in the crowd, thank you all so much. Also, speaking of Leadville, we are working on something big. I don't want to say too much because it is very early on, but hopefully this summer we will have something that has yet to happen in Leadville come through. So stay tuned. We're so excited. If we can get this to work and do everything that we want to do, it's going to be huge. Not only for us, but for any and everyone who chooses to be involved with it. Also, this summer, we may actually be hitting the road. We are planning a cross Colorado tour. And then we are working on another tour that will take us all the way to Montana and back. That one is going to be an interesting one if we can make it happen, but we are currently in talks with some people to get that one going and just make the most of it. You know, just really have a good time and take our small town humor to again, any and everyone who will listen and hopefully make some people laugh, not get chased out of town, and have a good time along the way. Now, of course, again, if you've listened to the show, you know all about Rite of Passage. Uh, but for anyone who may be tuning in for the first time, Rite of Passage is an overnight oats company owned by me. It's vegan, it's gluten free. I do everything myself. Uh, it started off as something I just did to save money on breakfast, but now it has become something a bit more. And I'm very fortunate to be able to feed people and to be able to offer something to people who prior to this felt as though they had no real options or representation in the breakfast market. So if you ever have any questions or you're interested, you can always check us out. You can always check us out, High Altitude Comedy, on Instagram and Facebook. And for Rite of Passage, I'm on Instagram and Facebook as well, but I also have a website, which is riteofpassageoats.com. That's right, RITE, not right like the direction. So for tonight's episode, it's cold, it's snowy outside. I think we're on day 2 of like a 6-day snowstorm, supposedly. We'll see. So I decided to break out the cardigan. It is very comfortable. I highly recommend to any and everyone. If you don't own a cardigan, go to a thrift store and pick one up. It's like wearing a hug from someone's grandma. It's like it's comfortable. It's got a good amount of weight to it, but it's not like too heavy. But then it's warm, but it's not too hot where you're sweating. I I got this thing like 5 or 6 years ago, and honestly, it makes me feel like a black Mister Rogers. Like I wish I had like a thing of tea and like a little train set, and I don't know. That's I just enjoy it. So hopefully, if you ever pick up a cardigan, you can relate, or maybe you'll be like, "This is dumb as shit," but it is what it is. Now, for anyone who may be asking, what is vulnerability? Vulnerability is the act of exposing our true selves, our weaknesses, and our fears. Now, let's break that down. The act of exposing our true selves, our weaknesses, and our fears. That is a terrifying statement within itself. Like the prospect of someone potentially seeing that true person, looking past the facades, looking past the show that we put on, and seeing the real you that only you know is crazy. There are people who spend their entire lives working to prevent that from ever happening. There are people who spend their entire lives doing the opposite of that, which is the inverse, or to be invulnerable. Now, I look at being invulnerable a lot like building a home on wetlands, where it's like if your foundation isn't stable, it doesn't matter how much concrete you pour or how high you build those walls. Your foundation is going to crack, those walls are going to give way, and everything you've been trying your hardest to keep inside is just going to come pouring out at some point. Now, you may ask yourself, why? Why do people fear being vulnerable? Why put their walls up so high? And a lot of that is based in fear. Fear of rejection. Let me fix that. You may find yourself asking, why do people fear being vulnerable? Why do they put their walls up so high? And it's just that things are based in fear. We resist being vulnerable because we have this fear of rejection, fear of judgment, and this phobia of appearing weak. But that in itself is a bit of a paradox because if we're scared to be our truest selves around another person or even with ourselves, how can we ever have genuine connections? How can we ever have that that true bond? So, therein lies the paradox of being vulnerable. While it can feel scary, vulnerability is the key to authentic and deeper intimacy with not only ourselves but with everyone around us. Now let's really think about that that facade that we put on, or that mask that we wear. When you put so much into putting on a face, sometimes you might be able to get away with it. But at a certain point, people know when you're being genuine and when you're not. And being vulnerable is a very simple and easy way to foster trust in not only people's trust in you, but your trust in people. Why? Because simply put, vulnerability builds trust by showing our willingness to be open and be honest with our partners. Now, why, you ask? Because simply put, vulnerability builds trust by showing our willingness to be open and honest with the people in our lives. Now, we've all been at an event with our friends or our loved ones or even, our significant others, and we can tell when they're not being honest for whatever the case may be. You can see when something's bothering them, but they're putting on that face, and you want to be there for them, but you don't really know how because they won't allow you to be. Now, this is something I have struggled with long time, and even now, allowing people to be there for me is a struggle. When I was younger, as a black boy, being vulnerable equates to being weak, and people will go out of their way to clown you for being vulnerable, for being what they see as lesser than, because you're not keeping whatever that feeling is, that negative emotion, and you're not shoving it down like the people around you do. And the idea of that was something that was ingrained in me from pretty early on, not so much by my family, but by the community. You think about it, like you're told from the time that you're a child, boys don't cry, be a man, suck it up. And I feel like that has done irreparable damage, not only to black men, but all men, because we don't know how to temper our emotions. We don't know how to engage with them. So it's like a damn wall. That damn wall is only but so strong. And as the water builds up on the other side of that damn wall, at a certain point, it's going to give out. And when it does, all those emotions come pouring out of us. And we see it every day. Like these people who just fly off the handle about something that would normally just be seen as extremely inconsequential. It's because they have so many other things in their lives that they've been pushing down that this was the boiling point. Someone cut them off in traffic, so they decide to empty a clip in their back window. Someone accidentally bumped into them. Now someone's getting carried away in a stretcher because they got stabbed. Like this is it's crazy. Like how many people have lost their lives or almost lost their lives because a motherfucker was having a bad day but didn't want to address it and be vulnerable. So they just tried their best to shove that shit deep down inside. And because of that, someone lost their life or someone was injured. Like that's just crazy to me, man. But to me, that is why we not only have to be vulnerable with ourselves, but we should be vulnerable in our relationships with the people around us. Because, quite simply, when we're vulnerable with our partners and the people around us, for authentic we create a space for authentic connections, deeper intimacy, and making our relationships more resilient. Now, going back to the metaphor I used before, if being invulnerable with yourself is like building a home on wetlands, not being vulnerable in a relationship is like Indiana Jones when they got to go across some wood bridge that's swinging and swaying above a river, and all the boards are fucking moldy, and all that's holding it together is just rope and wood. And there's one person who always looks down, and every time they take a step, they hear things creaking and shit starts breaking. That's your bond. That's your relationship with another person. Now you think about that. Think of this might only relate to me. I love bridges. I love bridges. I love trains. Now think of the coolest bridge you've ever seen. That's your opportunity to be vulnerable with another person and to be there and to have that genuine connection versus that scary ass Indiana Jones rope bridge. That's probably going to snap because that's usually what always happens in the movies. They're like, oh, this rope's been here for 200 years. And the second you get a quarter of the way through, that bitch snaps in half. Don't know why it's always halfway down that it snaps, but it always does. Now, like I've said, being vulnerable isn't easy. And truthfully, if it was, there would never be a need to talk about it. Because if shit was easy all the time, we wouldn't even think twice about it. And for some people, being vulnerable is very easy. It's like waking up, taking a breath, and tying your shoes. Like you don't even have to think twice about it. But for a lot of us, this shit is tough. Like allowing someone to see you, not the person you want to be, not the person you're trying to be, but just seeing you. Now, there's a lot of fear that comes attached with that, right? So you may ask, how do I overcome those fears of being vulnerable? And it's not easy. It's every day, you know, just like positive affirmations, just like positive thinking, just like everything else that we talk about in this podcast. It's not a one-time thing. This is a every day we're working on these things because shit ain't sweet out here, man. Like we always got shit happening in our lives that's going to have the potential to hold us back or even push us all the way back to the person that we used to be. But the goal is to never go back to the person that we used to be and to always be moving forward. And we may stumble and we may fall, but we get up and we keep going. That's the goal to me, you know? Like I've said on prior episodes, I see myself as a garden. I'm constantly working on this garden. And for anyone who's been a gardener, there might be maybe a couple days, couple weeks where you're not out there putting in work. But if you do everything right and then you start to neglect your garden, that shit is done for. All the weeds come back, all the critters come back and start eating your shit. Stuff starts dying, roots start choking each other out. So we gotta make an effort to constantly be working on ourselves. So a big part of working on myself is, of course, recognizing and challenging negative beliefs. I think about it every day. So with this article that I found, it states recognizing and challenging negative beliefs comes down to identifying and challenging limiting beliefs that might be holding us back from being vulnerable. Now, you think about that. I think about it all the time. It again goes back to a lot of the things that I was told as a child. You know, boys don't cry, be a man. Like, like being told like you're being a bitch because you're crying, or get whatever you were told, that shit did something to you because you started to buy into it and you started to believe that you were these things if you were vulnerable and you faced your emotions. I've seen some tough things in my life. I've had to be there when people get to call that a family member was murdered, and to see someone get that call and they still repress all of those emotions and just try to put a lid on it, like that shit is crazy. Like that's like the one time you should be allowed to be like unabashedly emotional and vulnerable, and motherfuckers were still trying to clown them for that. Like being there for the birth of your child, and niggas are scared to cry or be happy. I used to try so hard to never be vulnerable. I wouldn't even smile in public. You know how crazy that is? Like not smiling in public. If I made eye contact with another person, I'm immediately scowling. The main reason why I did it was because I never wanted to get called on not being tough enough, not being a quote unquote real man. And that's a crazy concept, that this societal notion that being vulnerable or being emotional, good or bad, somehow makes you a lesser person. We all have emotions. Unless you're like a bona fide sociopath and you don't feel anything, motherfucker, you have emotions. And to call someone weak for having the same things that you have is diabolical work. I've told this story before. I've told it on stage. But my very first time in a grocery store here, I had a man smiling at me and I threatened to kill him. It's something I've turned into a joke, but that's facts. Like I was so caught off guard by this person being vulnerable and being friendly towards me that I threatened to kill a man for being nice to me in a grocery store. That man didn't do anything wrong. He didn't deserve that. But I was so scared of this societal pressure and the off chance that someone was going to call me lesser than, that I threatened to take another man's life. I went, shit, I can say maybe 15 years without ever telling the person I love them, because I was scared to be vulnerable with people, even my family members. I wouldn't hug people. I wouldn't laugh with people. I wouldn't tell them I loved them. I wouldn't do any of that stuff. And truthfully, it had me fucked up. I had this pain that I was carrying around that I refused to acknowledge. And carrying pain around and not acknowledging it is like the motherfucker in every action movie that gets shot in the stomach and they're just running and then all of a sudden they collapse, and then they see it and they're like, no, 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 I'm good, I'm good. And then within seconds, they're gone. Or like the motherfucker in every zombie movie who gets bit and hides it. You're hiding that pain. You know that it's there, but you refuse to address it because you hope by ignoring it, it'll go away. But I can tell you definitively, it does not go away. It only gets worse. It eats away at you. It tears you down from the inside out. It leaves you fucking hollow, man. Truthfully, it wasn't until I saw what me building those walls so high was doing to my family, how me being so closed off from the world and being so invulnerable did to them. It was hurting my family that they couldn't have a conversation with me. I didn't have friends. I didn't have people in my life that I had strong bonds with. But deep down inside, it hurt me that I didn't have that. But not having those friendships and those relationships and those bonds while actively fighting against having those friendships, relationships, and bonds goes back to the paradox of being vulnerable. Because if I'm scared to address the pain, if I'm scared to talk about it, if I'm scared to do these things, how can anybody ever make it inside to help me, to be there with me and for me? It's never gonna fucking happen. Don't get me wrong. I practice the idea that not everyone deserves full access to me at all times. I set restrictions on how much access people have to me because a big part of being vulnerable is starting small and slowly increasing the vulnerability. A lot of people mess up is they learn a little bit about vulnerability, so they start trauma dumping on anyone they come in contact with. That's hard, but it's also extremely unfair, not only to you, but to the person that you're doing this to. Because if they don't know how to turn that off, they are now taking on all your trauma, all your issue. Well, I don't want to say issues. They're taking on all your trauma. They're taking on all your past experiences, and a lot of people don't. They don't know how to handle that kind of stuff. So the best thing I could say is start small. Maybe share a personal experience or express your feelings about something that really matters to you. Another big thing to do is to practice self-compassion. This all goes back to that internal monologue or internal dialogue we had or we touched on during the positive affirmations episode. We always have to remember to be gentle with ourselves and remember that everyone struggles with vulnerability. If you're sitting in a mirror putting yourself down, then all you're doing is hurting yourself. And if you're hurting yourself and the truest form of you is a hurt, scared individual, when it comes time to be vulnerable, you may lash out at yourself. You may lash out at that person who you're going to share this experience with. Things may just go horrible. So, just like everything else, you know, I forgot who said this saying to me, but they said, I would rather you dip a toe in and be comfortable than to jump into the deep end and drown. So, we've reached a segment where we touch on how to practice vulnerability in our actions. When a person is talking to you, practice active listening. A lot of people aren't really listening when you're talking to them or when they're talking to you. They're just thinking about what they're going to say next. So actively listen. Take a second, digest what they're saying, and don't just be ready to fire something back. If they say something, just let it hang in the air for a second. Think about what you really want to say, because the whole goal is to show that you care about their perspective. I think another issue with people when they're being vulnerable but they're not fully comfortable with the idea is, again, they lash out, especially when talks about emotions or communication come up. So the next thing we can do is practice open communication. So the best way to do that is to express your feelings and needs honestly and respectfully, creating a safe space for dialogue. There are a lot of people that I've come in contact with that they don't know how to just have dialogue or have a conversation. It's 0 to 100. Like, they will be chilling, and then all of a sudden it just devolves into an argument. And not everything has to be an argument. If you're wrong, you're wrong. If you're right, you're right. But it doesn't mean you automatically have to throw it in someone's face or use whatever they are discussing with you to hurt them because they're being vulnerable, but you aren't willing to be. And sometimes when we are attempting to be vulnerable, something that is said could turn around and hurt us. But again, understanding that and knowing when a person is being malicious versus when a person is being honest and their words just happen to hurt us are is very important because those are two very different situations. Now, I feel as though again as a black man talking to family about boundaries and being vulnerable can be hard because sometimes that means addressing past trauma. That means addressing situations that you wanted to leave in the past, but in order to heal from them, you can't just ignore them forever because, it's always going to be eating away at you. And in the past few years, there's been a lot of use of the word generational trauma, wherein, we're told for men to be emotional and to talk about our feelings makes us feminine, makes us lesser men. And that is something that we as men have to unlearn. Cause again, that shit will have you fucked up. Like you're scared to talk about what hurts you, what hurts you, like what makes you upset. Like that's crazy. The only people who will clown you for having those talks are people who are more emotionally stunted than you are. So you're letting a person who's bleeding out laugh at you for bleeding out. And that's something I had to learn. Like it doesn't make me weak to talk about my emotions, to talk about my hopes, my fears, my aspirations, like horrible things that have happened in my past. Like they happened, like the fact that so many people have had traumatic things happen to them and they're still here speaks volumes to their strength and resilience. So going back and talking about them is one step closer to healing from that thing completely. And I feel like even as a person who may be, one of the younger one of the younger generations in your family, being vulnerable and having emotional intelligence may be a way to show your elders how they should have been with you and how they still have the potential to be with themselves and be with the future generations, your kids, your grandkids. Like to unlearn a lot of that stuff is very important. Like with my nephews, I don't have kids of my own, but with my nephews and my nieces, I tell them, like, if you're crying about something, clearly whatever this was, whatever this is important enough that you're crying. So I'm not saying sit here and throw a pity party for yourself, but acknowledge it. That way you learn how to move past it. Whatever you're crying about, I might not understand, but I'm not you. I'm not going through this situation right now. You are. And I feel that's also something we have to unlearn is to tell people, well, other people got it worse than you. Yeah, there's a lot of motherfuckers who have it worse than me, but I'm still going through this particular situation. Like if I lose something of sentimental value and I cry about it, like for someone to clown me, you don't understand the sentimental value that's attached to it. The person who gave me that could be gone, you know? Like it could have been a friend who passed, could have been a family member who passed, could have been something that reminded me of one of the best days of my life. And the fact that it's gone now means that I have now lost a physical tether to that person or that day. And for most people, they might say, oh, okay, whatever. But for some people, they're like, damn, like, I remember when I lost this. Like, I talk a lot about traumatic experiences that I've gone through on stage when I do comedy, and it's my way of taking power back from these situations that stunted my ability to be around other people and to have meaningful relationships. And there was a story that I told, And after the show, this, fucking buff ass dude pulled me to the side and he was like, "Hey man, I want to thank you for telling that story. I went through a similar experience and I felt like I wasn't a man because that happened to me. So hearing you talk about it lets me know that it's okay for me to talk about it." And I always recommend talking to a therapist about this kind of stuff, or really anything. Like, if it, good or bad, talk to a fucking therapist. Like, they're licensed professionals. I am not, nor will I ever claim to be unless I decide to make a huge career change in the next couple years. But there are things that we need to unpack and that we need to address if we're ever going to heal from them and move past them. And the best way to do that is to foster a safe space for others. Like, I see there's a lot of these dudes, like, when you go out drinking, they're all strong manly men. And the second they get drunk, they're all over their boys, telling them how much they love them. I guarantee you there's something to that. This is probably something they don't feel comfortable saying when they're sober. This is probably something they were told when they were younger, like, don't say that. You don't tell another man you love him. You don't treat another man with respect. And that's fucking crazy to me. Like, I tell the people in my life that I love them every chance I get. And my goal is to create an environment where people feel comfortable expressing their vulnerability without the fear of judgment. I don't know if it's a compliment or an insult. I'll take it as a compliment. I've been told that I give off dad energy, whatever the fuck that means. And I had a girl tell me that one time. So I asked her, like, what do you mean by that? And she told me, she was like, I don't know exactly why, but she was like, when you and I talk, she was like, I just want to open up and talk about things, and things I don't talk to anyone else about. And I appreciate that people feel so comfortable to tell me stuff like that, or to just feel as though they can trust me with their fears, their hopes, their dreams, their aspirations, whatever the case may be. I'm not saying if you ever see me in the street, stop. Can't even talk right. I'm not saying if you ever see me in the street, stop me and tell me about the guy that you murdered 15 years ago. I don't want to be an accessory to murder. Don't tell me about the time you drunk drove and almost crashed into a house. I don't want to know about that kind of shit. My goal is to always make people feel comfortable enough that if we are talking about a particular topic or subject, we don't have to pivot away because they're uncomfortable unless they decide to do that thing. But truthfully, for the most part, when I'm talking to people in an intimate setting, there are very few things that are off the table. Why, you ask? Because I know what it's like to feel like a failure. I know what it's like to tear myself down. And again, this is something I'm constantly working on for myself. So the least that I can do is be there to help someone else, because I embrace my imperfections. I embrace who I am now, who I was yesterday, and who I was 10 years ago. Because if I just act as though the person that I used to be never existed, then I can never hold myself accountable for who I was, who I am, and who I will be in the future. Because honestly, fucking up is a part of being human. It's a part of the human experience. Like, we all fuck up. There's this weird idea that we have to be perfect all the time, and that's just not the case. Like, I guarantee you, the most perfect person messes up from time to time. Your pastor has probably done some fucked up shit in their lives. Like, your parents, you, like, we all have times where we're not the best version of ourselves, but we can't beat ourselves up about it. I'm not saying lean into it and become a fucking villain, but ask for forgiveness, be vulnerable, and be willing to face what you did, accept the consequences, and then that you don't fuck up in that same way again. So I think this is a good spot to end tonight's episode. So let's do a brief recap of what we learned tonight. Don't be afraid to be vulnerable. Start off small, work your way up from there, build stronger, more longer lasting relationships with the people that matter most to you. Overcome those fears that you have related to being vulnerable. Don't be scared of rejection or judgment or appearing weak. Remember to practice self-compassion. Be gentle with yourself. When you're talking to other people, practice active listening and create a safe space for open communication. Work on your emotional intelligence. That is developing self awareness and the ability to understand and manage your emotions. Not everything has to go 0 to 100. It shouldn't go from a casual conversation straight to full on yelling. There's a lot of space in between those two things. And I guarantee you, once you learn that, you'll realize just how many arguments don't need to happen because you feel attacked. And the most important thing is embrace your imperfections. Nobody's perfect. We all mess up. But again, it comes down to our ability to recover and keep going. I don't know. It's a hard episode. Being vulnerable is something I work on every single day. And hell, this podcast is my attempt at being vulnerable with anyone who listens to this. And I hope this episode and this podcast helps you to be able to be vulnerable and to be better than you were before. So as we wrap up, let me remind you of 3 things. Be good to yourself, be good to the world around you, and above all else, remember, I love you, homie. If you have any questions, concerns, or you just want to chop it up, you can hit me up on Instagram, Threads, and what else do I have? Let me go back and fix this. If you have any questions, concerns, or you just want to chop it up with me, you can feel free to hit me up on Instagram or Threads under the Homie Love Hour. You can email me at thehomielovehour@gmail.com. I have a Patreon. There are some exclusives that are behind a paywall. It starts at $2 a month. So I'm not getting rich off of this. There will be more interviews that will go up behind there. The snippets will, of course, go on to social media, but the full interviews will go on Patreon and Apple Podcast for subscribers only. I have stickers that, as of yesterday, shipped out, so they should be here hopefully in the middle of next week. So look for those to be coming out, and then just working behind the scenes to get bigger and better things coming you all's way. Reach out, tap in, whatever you want to do. Be good to yourselves, be good in the world around you. I love you. Talk to you soon.